Welcome back, everyone. We are once again doing topic one after topic two. So if you're looking at your handout, we're now going to be talking about first century Judaism and Christianity, which should be the first topic on your handout. So what we're going to do in this part of the lecture is we're going to start out by talking a little bit about the Second Temple period and what happened historically during this period. This is the period in which the New Testament was written, so the actual historical events are kind of important. Then we're going to talk briefly about first century Jewish sects. If you don't know what a sect is, don't worry, we're going to explain that a little bit later. And then we're going to talk about first century Christianity. Let's start out by talking a bit about the Second Temple period. So we are in the region of Israel once again. During this time in history, this area is known as Judea. So we're right here in our red circle again. We're once again right here in this region where the Hebrew Bible was mostly written. We're back here again. Now, you may remember that at the end of lecture last time, the Persians had come in and they had conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and because the Persians had conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, they were allowing the different people groups that the Babylonians had scattered around the empire to go home and rebuild their temples. So we remember that the Judeans who had been exiled, many of them go back to the region of Judah. They rebuild their temple, they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and they start kind of reestablishing their community there in Judea. Around 520 is when they managed to build their second temple in Jerusalem. This is why this period is going to be called the Second Temple period, because they've just built their second temple. The first temple was the one that David and Solomon put together back in the early 900s BCE, that was destroyed in 586 when Nebuchadnezzar came through. So we're now on the Second Temple. Now, the Judeans are living pretty happily there in Judea, but after a while, the Persians get driven out. And the Persians had started to become kind of difficult, so the Judeans are not all that sad to see them go. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great comes through from Greece and Macedonia, and he basically takes over the entire Persian Empire in a pretty short span of time. He gets to Jerusalem in 330 BCE, and he and the high priests in Jerusalem seem to get on pretty well, at least according to the historian Josephus. However, in 323 BCE, Alexander dies without a clear heir. He does have a son, but that son is very young, and there's no one very trustworthy to step in as regent. So what ends up happening is that Alexander's generals divide up Alexander's empire among them. Originally, there are about 34 different generals who each get a piece of the empire, I think, but ultimately, a lot of the more powerful generals keep sort of taking over stuff. And so ultimately, there are only really 4 generals that are dividing the empire between them. In particular, there are 2 generals, General Ptolemy, who took over Egypt, and General Seleucus, who took over Mesopotamia, who are kind of active in the region of Judea. Now, because of what we've talked about before, how Judea is basically on all these important trade routes, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids both want to control that territory, so they keep fighting back and forth over that region where Judea is. And sometimes the Ptolemies of Egypt are controlling that region, and sometimes the Seleucids of Mesopotamia are controlling that region. As you can imagine, it is not very fun to be living in Canaan during this time, because you never know who is going to come through with an army next. Here's just a picture. You can see the kingdom of Ptolemy here. So we've got Egypt and the Sudan and North Africa here, and in this picture, they've managed to take over part of Canaan. They've also got Cyprus. So they've got all this. And then you can see that Seleucus has taken over a big chunk of the former Persian Empire, stretching all the way over here into Central Asia. So you can see these two groups, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they're going to be fighting over this region right here. Now, obviously, the Judeans don't really like this, and there end up being additional problems because the Seleucids in particular do not respect the Jewish religion at all, and they keep interfering with Jewish religion when they're in control of the region. And so ultimately, the Jews are like, nope, we're not having it. And so a particular family, the father is Matthias, and then he has a son, Judas, and a bunch of other sons. And they all rebel against the Seleucids and say, okay, we want to become independent so that we can protect the Jewish religion and Jewish identity. And that's in 167 BCE. They are quite successful, partly because there are a number of different claimants to the Seleucid Empire at this point. And so you have these different members, these different descendants of General Seleucus, and they're all kind of fighting over who's going to be in charge. So because of that, there's an opening for people kind of at the fringes of the Seleucid Empire to break off and become independent. So that's what happens. This family, which becomes known as the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, they successfully rebel. Judea becomes an independent nation, and it's ruled by the descendants of this family, known as the Hasmonean dynasty. And this dynasty acts both as kings and as the high priests of the temple in Jerusalem. So at first, this seems like a really good thing. Judea is independent again. They can protect themselves. They can keep their religion. Unfortunately, some of the later Hasmonean kings were not really respecting the Jewish religion either. So, and we see a lot of things where they're taking bribes or, they're bribing the Seleucid king to get some help with something. They're killing their relatives. It gets quite messy. As we all know, political leaders aren't always the best members of a society. Anyway, so these Hasmonean kings are now causing problems for the kingdom of Judea. It gets to the point where there are these two particular claimants to the Hasmonean throne who are cousins, and they're basically fighting over who is going to be in control. Now, they happen to hear about a powerful general from another nation who is up conquering Syria. This general is a guy named Pompey, who, as you guys may know, is going to become one of the first triumvirate along with Julius Caesar and Cassius. So Pompey is up there busy taking over Syria for Rome, and they send him a message saying, hey, can you come and help decide this situation? I feel like they should have expected what happened next. So 63 BC, he comes down and he just takes over Judea. He does let one of the cousins remain the high priest, but he gives the kind of ruling power to this Idumean general who had previously worked for the Hasmoneans, this guy named Antipater, and he is made the procurator of Judea. So he's given kind of a Roman official title. So the Romans have now taken over Judea. Now, this ends up being pretty good for this Idumean general Antipater, because in 40 BCE, his son Herod is confirmed as the king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. Now, I want to point out, Antipater was Idumean. Herod is Idumean. They're technically not Judean, but they're put in charge because they've been loyal to the Romans. So Herod is now the king of the Jews. Herod is a pretty impressive guy in a lot of ways. He's very clever. He makes a lot of good alliances. He's very militarily successful. He stays on good terms with the Romans. He's also a really horrible person, though. He ends up killing his mother-in-law and his wife and some of his sons, and he's got a lot of problems. So he, on the one hand, did some good stuff, but he was also just a really wrecked person in his personal life. He was one of the things that he did to try to keep the Jewish people on his side. He spent a lot of resources renovating that temple in Jerusalem. It had gotten in not great shape recently, and so he gives it some nice renovations. So here's a picture of a model of what Jerusalem looked like in the Second Temple period. This here is the temple here at the back. So we've got this outer wall with all these columns. Herod added all that. He built all that. And then in the middle, we have this kind of mini fortress outlining the holy area. And then inside, we have a Holy of Holies. And Herod had a lot of this redone as well. Herod also built this fortress right over here. This is the Antonia Fortress, which he named after his good buddy Mark Antony. So this fortress is here to protect the temple and also to kind of watch the temple. He also built a ton of other stuff, but we're not going to get into that today. So he did all this, and so that kind of helped keep the Jewish people on his side because they're like, wow, this guy just spent a massive amount of money out of his own pocket to renovate our temple for us. So that's like this big act of respect for their religion, even though he has a very sketchy personal life. Now, ultimately, in 4 BCE, Herod dies, and there's some excitement about who's going to succeed him as king of the Jews. And it turns out that Herod's surviving sons cannot agree on this, and they end up kind of annoying the Romans so much that the Romans are just like, okay, we're going to divide up this area and give some to one of his sons and some to a different son and some to a different son, because none of you guys seem super great. So they do that. And the particular son, Archelaus, who was put in charge of the Jerusalem area, he shortly shows himself to be just, you do not want him in charge of anything ever. So the Romans remove him from power and they just put a Roman official in charge of this area here. However, some of Herod's other sons remain in control up here in the north. Now, over time, we're now after about 6 CE. Over time, the relationship between the Romans and the Jews sort of gradually gets worse and worse because the Romans don't really respect the Jewish religion, and you have this succession of different officials being put in charge of Judea. A lot of them were previously posted in completely other parts of the Roman Empire. They know nothing about the Jews, and so they keep on annoying and offending the Jews. Sometimes they don't really care that they've done that. Sometimes they try to backtrack it once they realize the problem they've created. But the situation gets worse and worse. There's this one point when Emperor Caligula decides that, hey, he's going to have a statue of himself put in the temple in Jerusalem, the temple of the God of the Hebrew Bible, and people have to worship his statue there. And he also wants to rename the temple to basically be a temple of Jupiter. The Jews were absolutely not having that, and they staged a massive nonviolent protest. Thankfully, Caligula died before he could actually enforce having his statue put in the temple. Anyway, things have not been going well, and by the time we hit 66 CE, the Jews are like at the end of their rope with this whole situation. Okay. In 66, the Roman official who is in charge of the area steals a ton of money from the temple. He didn't just embezzle the tax money, although he was probably doing that too, according to Josephus. He stole a bunch of stuff out of the temple, which is just so disrespectful to the God of the Hebrew Bible and to the Jewish religion. And so the Jews rebel. This rebellion lasts several years. Unfortunately, the Romans are very powerful and the Jews really are not. So this ends kind of how you would expect. In 70 CE, the Jews' second temple in Jerusalem is destroyed in this war. Jerusalem, the rest of Jerusalem is destroyed. A lot of Jewish leaders are destroyed, and things are very bad. After 70 CE, a lot of the Jews who had been living in Judea end up scattering to other parts of the Roman Empire. There had been a lot of Jews who had kind of moved around the Roman Empire before this, but now they're trying to get out of Judea. A lot of people are trying to get out of that region because things are not great there right now. However, in these Jewish communities that are scattered around other parts of the Roman Empire and that have even scattered into the nearby Parthian Empire, into Mesopotamia, they're continuing to develop Jewish oral traditions. So they have religious traditions that they pass down orally about how you should keep the law, how you can keep your relationship with the God of the Hebrew Bible now that there's no temple, these kinds of things. They're developing basically Jewish law. How can you continue to be a Jew and live a Jewish life, even though you're far from Judea and some of the things in the Hebrew Bible that you're supposed to do are no longer possible? These oral traditions were eventually written down as the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are still important to many Jews today. I think you'll hear more about the Mishnah and Talmud in our unit on Judaism and modern Israel. So this is just to show you, if you're starting here in Judea, in Jerusalem, the Jews moved all over the Roman Empire. So we see them moving into basically what's modern Turkey, Greece, Italy. They're moving as far as Spain. They're in North Africa. So all around the Mediterranean coastline, they're moving into those regions. They're also moving out of the Roman Empire into the nearby Parthian Empire over on this side. So they've spread around all over the place at this point. So what are some kind of major takeaways that we can get from this picture of the historical context during the Second Temple period? During the Second Temple period, the Jews were often ruled and sometimes mistreated by other groups, such as the Persians, the Ptolemies and Seleucids, and the Romans. When they were independent under the Hasmonean dynasty, there was kind of a period where things were going well, and then things started going bad because a lot of their rulers were corrupt, and the people knew this. They knew that, hey, this particular leader bribed somebody in order to become the high priest. This particular leader assassinated his brother in order to become the high priest, this kind of thing. So the people were aware of this, and so that's not giving them a lot of confidence in their leadership, as you can imagine. These things, having this pressure from outside groups and also this kind of uneasiness with what's going on inside their group, this leads to a lot of political and religious tension among the Jewish people. And it leads the people to be asking themselves, is our covenant, is our relationship with the God of the Hebrew Bible broken? What are we supposed to do about this? Can we fix the situation somehow? Can we fix our society somehow? And a lot of different people, a lot of ancient Jewish people had different answers to these questions about how they could try to fix the problems in their society, the problems in their relationship with the God of the Hebrew Bible, the problems in their relationship with one another. They had different answers to these things. So that's going to set up our next topic here. I would normally ask for questions, but as you know, I'm not here. Feel free to email me if you have any questions about what we've been talking about. So let's move into our next topic. We want to talk a little bit about first century CE Jewish sects. First up, we need to answer the question, what is a sect anyway? A sect is a group within a larger group. It usually refers to people who have a particular version of a religion, but it can also mean other things. So some sects are more political, but usually when we use the term sect, we're meaning a religious subgroup. So, for example, within Christianity, we have a lot of different, what are sometimes called denominations or traditions. So we have Catholics and Greek Orthodox and Presbyterians and Methodists and all kinds of different denominations, right? You could also call those sects if you wanted to. So if we're talking about first century CE Jewish sects, we're talking about different kinds of religious subgroups in the first century CE within Judaism. So during the first century CE, there were many, many, many different religious and political groups in Judea who were all trying to fix things either for themselves or for the Judeans more broadly in different ways. They all had different ideas about what was wrong with their society and how they could fix it. Some of the main groups are the Pharisees, that we're going to hear more about in a second, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Herodians, and the Zealots. The Sadducees were basically the group that was in control of the temple, and for the most part, they have a reputation in the ancient sources for kind of accommodating to Greek religion and to Roman power, and to kind of being okay with the fact that the Romans were in charge. The Essenes, on the other hand, were not okay with what was going on in the temple. They were not okay with being ruled by the Romans. They were just really hoping that the end of the world would come soon, so all these people that they didn't agree with would go away, and they would just be able to live in light. The Herodians were more of a political group rather than a religious group. The Herodians basically supported the family of Herod. They said the Herods are doing an okay job, and we basically support being part of the Roman Empire. The Zealots were kind of on the opposite side of that. They were like, we absolutely do not want the Romans in charge. We want an independent Judea or bust. So there were a lot of different groups of zealots. They were not very organized, and they just wanted to get rid of the Romans. So that's the Sadducees, Essenes, Herodians, and Zealots. Let's talk a bit more about the Pharisees to get a bit of a more detailed view here. The Pharisees were basically religious teachers and scholars, sometimes called rabbis and scribes, of the Hebrew Bible. So they cared a lot about the entire Hebrew Bible, and they knew it very well. And they took it very seriously. They thought you absolutely need to be following the laws that are in the Hebrew Bible that are part of this covenant between God and the Israelites and Judeans. They also took the oral traditions very seriously. So if, for example, you have some particular law in the Hebrew Bible, and then there are various oral traditions that have grown up around that of how to make sure that you keep that law. For the Pharisees, those traditions, those oral traditions, are just as important, and you need to pay just as much attention to those traditions as you do to the original text. So they're taking that all very seriously. Now, because they really care about what's going on in the Hebrew Bible, and because the temple in Jerusalem was an important part of the covenant between the God of the Hebrew Bible and the Judeans in the Hebrew Bible, they supported the temple in theory. However, they were very annoyed with the Sadducees, who were kind of in control of the temple, and what the Sadducees were up to. So they're like, yes, there needs to be a temple. The temple sacrifice needs to happen. The descendants of Aaron need to be the priests. But you actual people who are in charge of the temple are not doing a good job. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not get on. The Pharisees believed that all Jews should be taught the Hebrew Bible. So a lot of what the Pharisees, the more senior Pharisees would do is they would go around and they would teach people about what was in the Hebrew Bible. Even if these were ordinary people who couldn't actually read and write, these Pharisaic rabbis, teachers, would go around and teach about the Hebrew Bible. They also believed that non-Jews could and even should also be taught about the Hebrew Bible. So even if you're not a descendant of Abraham, even if you're not a descendant of Jacob, you can still be taught about the Hebrew Bible. That's still good for you. And it's not good to refuse to teach people about the Hebrew Bible just because they're not Jewish. That's kind of where the Pharisees are with all this. Here's a little example of some things that were said by two important Pharisaic rabbis. Hillel and Shammai were important rabbis towards the end of the life of Herod the Great and into the 1st century CE. So Hillel dies around 10 CE. Shammai, who is younger, hangs out for a while longer after that. Anyway, these two guys were very influential, partly because they were kind of on opposite sides of a lot of religious debates, even within the Pharisaic community, and everybody loves drama. So they were always debating with one another about how to correctly understand the oral tradition and these kinds of things. So this here, I have some quotes from the Pirkei Avot, the Sayings of the Fathers, which starts off with this collection of famous sayings by important rabbis, basically. So Hillel and Shammai received the oral tradition. Hillel used to say, let me move my little box here so I can read. Hillel used to say, "Be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving mankind and drawing them close to the Torah." So that sounds great. Hillel's like, you should love peace, you should love other people, you should draw people to the Hebrew Bible. That sounds pretty good. Hillel also used to say, "One who makes his name great causes his name to be destroyed. One who does not add to his knowledge causes it to cease. One who does not study the Torah deserves death. One who makes unworthy use of the crown of learning shall pass away." Hillel, what happened to you, dude? These things do actually go together. It's just, on the face of it, it seems kind of a surprise, right? One who does not study the Torah deserves death. What is Hillel saying here? Basically, he's trying to say, if you have the capability and if you have the ability to study the Torah, if you're a literate person, if you have time to study the Torah and you don't do it, he's like, you should just die. You should just die because you're ignoring the most important thing in the world. That's what he thinks. So he's like, you need to be chasing after the Hebrew Bible. You really need to dedicate yourself to that. Shammai says something that's somewhat similar. Shammai used to say, "Make your study of the Torah a fixed practice." He's basically saying, you should be studying the Hebrew Bible every day for a certain amount of time. So you should be diligent to study the Hebrew Bible. "Speak little, but do much, and receive all men with a pleasant countenance." So these are some of these things out of the oral tradition that Hillel and Shammai say. And then the later rabbis are going to receive this and they're going to debate it in their turn, be like, what did Hillel mean? What did Shammai mean? So they become part of this larger centuries-long conversation. So Hillel and Shammai, two Pharisees of the early 1st century CE. Now, the different Jewish sects, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, they disagreed about a number of important religious questions. Things like, which parts of the Hebrew Bible are we responsible to follow? Just the Torah, just the first part of the Hebrew Bible, or the whole thing? Are we also responsible to follow the oral tradition as well as the written Hebrew Bible? If so, which oral traditions? Which parts of the oral tradition? So they all debated about these questions. They also debated about the question, is there a problem with the temple? So the Pharisees would have said there are problems in the temple, but the temple is still basically working the way it should to kind of keep the covenant between God and the Judeans working. So they would say, worshiping in the temple, it's still working. The Sadducees would say, there's no problem with the temple. Of course, it's still working. And the Essenes would say, no, the temple is completely messed up. It's not working anymore. We need to form a substitute temple. Just the temple is not working at all. So these different sects are really disagreeing about this important kind of central element about the Jewish religion. They're also disagreeing about things like, is the end of the world coming soon? What is that going to look like? What do we need to do to be on the right side of God's judgment at the end of the world? Are we expecting a Messiah figure? We'll talk more about what a Messiah is on the next slide, but the different sects are disagreeing about this. So the Pharisees and the Essenes are both saying, yeah, the end of the world is coming soon. We're expecting a Messiah. The Sadducees are like, I don't know about that. I don't know if the end of the world is coming soon, and we're really not expecting a Messiah. And then the Pharisees and the Essenes, even though they agree the end of the world is coming soon, they disagree quite a bit on what that's going to look like and on what they need to do to kind of get through the end of the world. The sects also disagree about whether non-Jews can become Jews. The Pharisees are like, yes, they can become Jews. They should become Jews. The Essenes are like, no, they absolutely can't become Jews. You can't go telling people about the Jewish religion. So there's a lot of disagreement among the Jewish sects about these questions. And the fact that there is this disagreement also is going to end up impacting what happens with early Christianity. Now, one of these issues about the end of the world, the sects are disagreeing about whether they're expecting a Messiah figure. Messiah, Mashiach, is a Hebrew word that just means anointed one. So someone who has had oil poured on their head in order to anoint them to a special role in society. In the Hebrew Bible, people who are anointed are usually kings or prophets or priests. So the Messiah could be any one of those things. The Hebrew Bible, especially in the prophetic sections, predicts that there's going to be a Messiah figure, or more than one, it's not always clear, who will come and fix the relationship between the Judeans and their God. That's the Messiah's most important job, is to fix that relationship between the Judeans and their God. Now, because the God of the Hebrew Bible and the Judeans in the Hebrew Bible have this covenant, right? Where if they keep the relationship, then the Judeans are blessed. But if they break the covenant, bad stuff happens, right? Do you remember this from last time? If the Messiah comes and fixes the relationship between the Judeans and their God, this will also fix things like sickness, violence, war, corruption, hunger. That's the idea of how this works. Now, during this period in time, the late 1st century BCE and the early 1st century CE, there were a lot of different people who sort of popped up and claimed to be the Messiah. Because pretty much everyone in the society understood the society's messed up, stuff is not going well, we need someone to fix what's going on, and it seems like our leaders are not going to do that because our religious leaders are the Sadducees, they're not fixing it, and our political leaders are the Romans. So a lot of people come up and they're saying they're the Messiah. There's Egyptian people who come and they're like, I'm the Messiah. There's all kinds of different people who are doing this. You can read about this if you're interested in Flavius Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. He writes about a lot of this. He's an ancient Jewish historian. Anyway, lots of people are saying this, and part of the issue that people were encountering was people were really hoping that the Messiah would come, but there was not a lot of agreement on how you would know whether someone's the Messiah and what they're going to do if they are the Messiah. But a lot of people are kind of assuming at this point that the Messiah is going to get rid of the Romans and that Judea is once again going to be an independent kingdom and that that's going to kind of fix the problems. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about first century AD Jewish sects. We got a little bit more information about the Pharisees, but we also know there are other groups running around like the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Herodians, and the Zealots. We've seen that the religious sects are disagreeing on a lot of important questions about the Jewish religion, and that some of them are expecting a Messiah. So now let's turn over to first century Christianity. So Christianity of the first century is, you can look at it from a lot of different angles, but one way you can look at it is as the most famous messianic movement from among the Jewish communities of this era. So in this time of political and religious tension, there arose a prophet known as Jesus of Nazareth. Like the Pharisees and the Essenes, he cared a lot about the entire Hebrew Bible, and he agreed that the Jews needed a Messiah to fix the world. However, he was different from the Pharisees and Essenes in general because he said he was the Messiah. And he's not only the Messiah, but he's actually the one and only Son of God. So that's what he comes saying. So sort of to explain here, the name Christian for the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, this arises because the word Mashiach in Hebrew, anointed one, you translate that into Greek as Christos, anointed one. So Christ is the Greek equivalent of Messiah, and a Christian is a follower or a slave of Christ. So that's where the label Christian came from. It actually was originally an insult that non-Christians used toward Christians. They're like, oh, you guys, you're slaves of Christ. But the Christians are like, oh, sure, okay, we'll just keep that name now. So that's kind of funny. So according to the New Testament, what does the life of Jesus of Nazareth look like? Jesus of Nazareth was born in Bethlehem in Judea, down here, before 4 BCE and is named Jesus. According to the Gospels, his mother Mariam became pregnant by the Holy Spirit, so by God, without the involvement of her husband Joseph. That's where the term virgin birth comes from. Now, Jesus, when he's young, there are a number of adventures that his family kind of has because the Herods are trying to kill him and they end up going to Egypt and then they end up moving into the Galilee. So they end up settling up here in Nazareth, which is why he's known as Jesus of Nazareth. Okay. Now, around 27 CE, Jesus' cousin John the Baptist comes out of the desert to tell ordinary Jews that they need to repent of their sins and believe in God. Jesus goes to his cousin at the Jordan River, somewhere around here, and is baptized. And that kicks off the period of time when Jesus is going to be, teaching the people. So from about 27 to 30 CE, Jesus is doing religious teaching in public and collecting students, which in Greek are discipuloi, disciples, like a rabbi. So he's doing the same thing that a lot of the Pharisees were doing. He's traveling around and he's telling people about the Hebrew Bible and explaining how they can have how they can fix their relationship with God, basically. As part of this, he ends up debating the Pharisees and the Sadducees quite a lot in a variety of different contexts. Now, we want to remember he's saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God, and the Pharisees and Sadducees are not going to be on board with that. Now, what does this kind of religious debate that he's having with the Pharisees and Sadducees, what does that look like? Here's an example from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. So we're at a point in Jesus' ministry when he has been going around teaching people for a while already. The Pharisees are already aware of him, and they're seeing that he's gathering a lot of influence. And so the Pharisees want to get rid of him, basically. He's competition. The people are listening to him and not to them, and the Pharisees don't necessarily like what he's saying, and so they're like, we need a way to get this guy in trouble. So then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you don't care about anyone's opinion, for you're not swayed by appearances. So they're starting in trying to kind of get him to let his guard down, right? Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, so the Roman emperor, or not? Now, I want you guys to realize how well chosen this question is on the part of the Pharisees, okay? So a lot of the Jewish people of this time are really not happy about the Roman government and about the fact that their nation is ruled by the Roman government, as you can imagine. So the Pharisees are asking this question, should we pay taxes to the Roman government? If Jesus says yes, then a lot of these people who've been following him around are going to be like, oh, he's a supporter of the Roman government. We're not going to listen to him anymore. And then they'll go back to listening to the Pharisees. On the other hand, notice that the Pharisees have brought the Herodians along with them. The Pharisees and the Herodians usually did not get on because the Herodians supported the Herods and the Roman government. The Pharisees tended to think it would be ideal if the Romans would go away. But they bring the Herodians along so that if Jesus, instead of saying, yes, we should pay taxes, if Jesus instead says, no, we shouldn't pay taxes to the Roman government, the Herodians can go to the Roman officials and be like, hey, this guy is trying to start a rebellion and saying that we shouldn't pay taxes. And then Jesus would be arrested and put in jail. So the Pharisees have chosen this question very carefully. But Jesus figures out the trap, right? He says, why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin that's used to pay the tax. So they brought him a denarius, a Roman coin. And Jesus said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this on this coin? And they said, Caesar's. So he says to them, therefore, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So he's basically said, give the Roman government what you should, and give God what you should. And so they hear that, and they're like, well, he answered that question pretty neatly. Like, nobody's gonna be, we can't put him in jail for that, and he's not gonna lose his following for that. So they leave him and go away. So this is the kind of thing that we have going on with these debates. There are a lot of other examples, but for reasons of time, we're going to move on. So around the year 30 CE, the religious leaders get together and they get the Roman procurator at the time, Pontius Pilatus, to execute Jesus for sedition. Basically, they're saying he says that he's a king of the Jews, and this is seditious against the Roman government because the Roman government is in charge. We don't have a king of the Jews currently. And so they get Pontius Pilatus to execute Jesus in Jerusalem. I don't know if you guys are aware, but earlier in the 1900s, there was kind of a whole debate about whether Jesus was even a real person and whether he was really executed. The ancient sources, though, I think are pretty clear. The Roman sources are clear that Jesus was a real person, he was executed. The Jewish historian Josephus may mention it. It's a little debated. And later Jewish sources are clear on the fact that Jesus was a real person who was executed, although they tell the story a little bit differently. So I think we're pretty clear on the fact, yes, Jesus is a real person. He's teaching stuff that the other religious leaders don't like, and he ends up being executed by the Roman government. According to the New Testament, 3 days after his burial, Jesus rises from the dead because he'd been saying he's the Son of God, right? So he's the Son of God, so he has the power to raise himself from the dead, and that's what he does. And then he hangs out with his students for 40 days and continues teaching them and explaining basically how the Hebrew Bible had predicted that he would come and that he would be the Messiah and be able to do this. And then he ascends back into heaven, where he sits down at the right hand of the God of the Hebrew Bible. Many of the Jews in Judea and in communities scattered around the Roman Empire believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So they become Christians. However, most of them also continued their Jewish religious practices, although with some modifications. So they didn't, in the early days, they didn't think that they stopped being Jews by being Christians. They were just Jewish Christians. That's how it was. Jesus' close students traveled around the Roman Empire to spread his message, sometimes being violently attacked. Sometimes this was by local lynch mobs, sometimes it was by government officials. A couple of his disciples end up being killed by Emperor Nero. So that is going on. Eventually, they start spreading the message to non-Jews as well. So at first, they were going around to these scattered Jewish communities and telling them about Jesus, and then they start telling non-Jews about Jesus. By the early 60s CE, even the Roman emperors are aware of Christianity. So this is pretty wild. Like, this is a day of very little communication where mobility is more difficult. There is a fair amount of mobility within the Roman Empire, but it's expensive to move around. So only 30 years after Jesus' execution, the Roman emperor knows who Jesus was and who these people are that are following Jesus. So that's pretty interesting. Here's an image that shows you a lot of the early sites of Christian churches. So this is by the end of the 1st century CE. Every single town with a name on it, there's a Christian church there. So you can see that Christianity has spread a lot from starting out with a relatively small group of people in Judea. It spread all the way up the coast. It spread into the islands. It spread into North Africa. It spread into Greece and Italy. It's all over Anatolia. So this is pretty impressive. Okay. So a couple of other things we want to talk about here. Here I've given you kind of a summary of what's in the New Testament. The New Testament is a collection of documents written in the 1st century CE, which form the foundation of the Christian religion. This collection includes a lot of different things. For example, there are 4 Gospels, which are basically accounts of the life of Jesus and his teaching. There's a history of the early Christians for after Jesus ascends into heaven. There are various letters written from important Christian leaders to various Christian churches, lots and lots of letters by a number of different people. And there's also an apocalypse, a set of visions of the end of the world as well. Now, what I want you to notice here is that almost all of the writers of these texts are Jews. So 3 of the Gospels are written by Jews. And then all of these letters are written by Jews. The only documents in here that aren't written by Jews are the Gospel of Luke, and then Luke also writes this kind of further history of the early Christians. Mark is kind of debated whether he was Jewish or not, but almost all of this is written by Jews. So Christianity was born not as a separate religion initially, but as a sect of the Jewish religion. The Christians, the early Christians, thought of themselves as still being Jews, and the Jews thought of the early Christians as being Jews. They were just weird Jews. So the whole process by which Judaism and Christianity eventually kind of move on to these separate tracks is actually a really interesting one. Unfortunately, it's outside of the scope of our discussion today. Feel free to email me with questions. Now, in the rest of our time, what I want us to see is why the Pharisees and Sadducees, so why these other Jewish sects had a problem with Jesus. So what was it about him that made them so annoyed that they're like, we just need this guy gone? So the first and most obvious thing is that he says that he is the Son of God. If that's not true, then that's absolute blasphemy. And the Pharisees and Sadducees are like, this is just a horrible, horrible thing to say and to lie about. And so we need to get rid of this guy. So if this isn't true, this is a big problem. He's also saying that he is the Messiah. So he's the one who is coming to fix the relationship between the Judean people and God. He's going to do that. And they're like, if you're lying about the Son of God thing, then we don't really trust you to fix our relationship with God. So they're not really on board with that either. Jesus also said that the whole Hebrew Bible was important, which would annoy the Sadducees because the Sadducees basically focused on the Torah portion, the first part of the Hebrew Bible. But Jesus also said whole Hebrew Bible, but not the oral tradition. This would annoy both the Pharisees and the Sadducees because both of them kept parts of the oral tradition and really cared about those. Jesus also says that the Jerusalem temple is going to be destroyed in the future. So remember, he's saying this around 27 to 30 CE. The temple hasn't been destroyed yet. That won't be until 70. He's prophesying this is going to happen, which none of them are going to want to hear, right? They're like, why would you say something scary about the temple? And he's also saying the temple isn't really working. So he's kind of with the Essenes there. He's like, the temple isn't really working because the priests are really corrupt. And when people are going to sacrifice at the temple, they're just kind of doing this as a way to check off boxes. They're not really doing it because they love the God of the Hebrew Bible. However, he says that he can basically fix the problem. And by his actions, he can basically act as a perfect priest and can also be a perfect sacrifice. So in the New Testament, the way this is framed is Jesus allows himself to be executed in order to kind of take on the punishment that normally goes onto the sacrificial animals that is deserved by the Judean people who are sacrificing those animals. That's how this is framed in the New Testament. So he is kind of taking on this punishment for sin, and so the people won't have to suffer it. And he is going to then raise himself from the dead and give people his innocence because he didn't break the law. He didn't break the covenant. It's complicated, but that's basically what's going on there. He also says that following the God of the Hebrew Bible isn't just for Jews, it's for everybody. So the Essenes would not like that. The Essenes would say, no, this is only for the Jews. But Jesus would say, nope, everybody can believe in the God of the Hebrew Bible. So here's some different examples kind of showing what Jesus had to say about these issues. So if we're trying to think about what parts of the Hebrew Bible are people responsible to follow, what about the oral tradition? Here's another place where the Pharisees are debating with Jesus. So the Pharisees say, they come to Jesus and they say, why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? For they don't wash their hands when they eat. He then answers and says, why do you break God's commands for the sake of your tradition? So, and he basically goes on and says, you've got this particular oral tradition that if you have given something to the temple and then have put yourself in an economic position where you can't care for your elderly parents, that's okay. Whereas Jesus is like, no, you should have thought about your elderly parents first. Make sure you take care of your elderly parents and don't just be like, hey, I just gave that to the temple, so it's okay that I'm not looking after my elderly parents. So he basically says, you guys, you Pharisees, are making your oral tradition more powerful than the Hebrew Bible itself. And he's like, you can't do that. The Hebrew Bible is the thing. Just the oral tradition is not the thing. He also does something pretty interesting. So a lot of the oral tradition consists of putting laws around the original laws of the Hebrew Bible. So say, for example, you have this original law, don't cheat on your spouse. Then the oral tradition comes along and it's like, to make sure that you don't cheat on your spouse, never be alone with a woman that you're not related to. Oh, okay. And then a later generation comes along and they're like, okay, well, if we're not supposed to be alone with a woman we're not related to because we're concerned about cheating on our spouse, let's add a little bit more to that to make it more secure that we won't cheat on our spouse. Just don't talk to women that you're not married to at all. In fact, don't talk to women that you're married to that much either, because you should probably be studying Torah instead. So the oral tradition kind of adds these layers and layers of kind of behavioral fences to try to protect the original law from the Hebrew Bible, to make sure that you can't possibly break that. Jesus isn't really in favor of the oral tradition and this kind of behavioral solution. So he does something interesting. He takes the moral law and he turns it inward instead of outward. So instead of adding kind of external behavioral fences that other people can see whether you're keeping or not and can kind of judge you on, he's like, you should think about what the roots of these different problems are in your heart and try to have your heart in the right place. So here's an example. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, you have heard it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. That's one of the 10 Commandments. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I say to you that anyone who is angry with someone else will be subject to judgment. So if you're so mad at someone that you wish you could hurt them, if you are like thinking to yourself, man, if only I wouldn't get in trouble for murdering them, I wish I could murder them. I'm just mad. I just wish I could hurt them in some way, but I'm not going to do it because there are consequences for that. He's like, if you wanted to do that in your heart, it's almost like you actually did it. So you shouldn't be doing that. So get your heart in the right place is kind of his solution. Also, if we're thinking about, should we tell non-Jews about the God of the Hebrew Bible? This is what the New Testament says. There is no distinction between Jew and Greek. Greek is just kind of their generic name for anyone who's not a Jew. There's no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So basically, here saying the God of the Hebrew Bible is everybody's God, and everybody should know about him. So this would annoy some of the Jews. So we've seen kind of these points of tension between what Jesus is saying and what some of the other religious leaders are saying. You can probably see by this point how he managed to annoy them enough that they ultimately decided he needed to be gotten rid of. However, as we talked about, that didn't end Christianity. Christianity grew and grew and grew after that point until by 30 years after his execution, even the Roman emperor knows who the Christians are. If you have any questions about any of this, please send me an email. I hope this was interesting to you. If you're interested to learn more, there are some various classes you can take. In particular, I'll point out MELC 307, which I teach, which is a class on From Israelites to Jews, basically talking about the period we discussed today in a whole lot more detail and getting to read a lot of what the Jews have to say about their ancient situation. And we have some other classes you could potentially take also listed on this slide. Thanks very much for your attention. Have a good rest of your day.